Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of InMobi's Mobile Monday Q&A series. For today, very excited to have Sandro Parenzo, VP of Product at Human, to talk about everyone's favorite topic to talk about, ad fraud. Sandro, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you, Matt. So, by the way, if anyone's looking for me online, it's Alessandro is my whole name. It's just, it's easier to say Sandro, so save you a few syllables of your day. So I recently joined Human, formerly WhiteOps, I think I'm on month 4, and I come from an agency background where I ran engineering teams and did product work, and I was at Snowflake Computing for a while. So I've seen a lot of the technology side of the ad industry, and I had the opportunity to join this team, and it was like finally to do stop doing ad tech and start doing something good, and by doing good by doing well, and really going after what I see as one of the biggest challenges in our industry is how money is funneled away from people who are just trying to reach audiences, which we can talk about the efficacy and the validity of that as a premise, but it's going to criminal enterprises, and that's the scary part. And when I had the opportunity to join this group, I was super excited. And now I'm running a product for the ad side of the business, and very excited to be here today.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think you really kicked off a lot of the themes that we are going to be talking about today. So thank you for that. So I think the one to start things off, let's kind of level set here. When we're talking about ad fraud, what are we talking about, and how prevalent are these issues so far?
Yeah, so ad fraud is a big topic, and well, I'd like to preface. Some folks think of ad fraud as being a measurement challenge. I personally don't consider it a measurement challenge. As I said, I think this is about taking down criminals and making sure that the ecosystem is cleaner overall. That goes for both sides of the fence. It doesn't matter if you're an advertiser who's losing a few bucks here, if that's how you're thinking about it, and it's just somehow affects your CPM, or I mean, think about consumers who are also affected by malware, or having their mobile devices corrupted in guise of trying to make a few bucks here and there. It sounds really not that scary when people think about it this way, until you realize more recently, one of the folks at Human, our team of detectives really kind of tracked down, was recently sentenced to 10 years in prison. So this is a real challenge, and it's one of these things we don't take lightly. We specify like a whole dedicated team to actually just going after these people, not just making better tech.
Yeah, wow. I guess someone actually got caught. That's always a good thing.
Well, the only sad thing about this, unfortunately, he's one of the far and few between. Most fraudsters basically can play in this space and then just get caught, shut down, and then literally spin up a whole new team and just keep doing what they were doing without any interruption. I mean, it's very rarely actually prosecuted, which is a big challenge.
So, one thing I think that it's kind of interesting, you brought up the ecosystem approach. And I think I can see, like, if I'm an advertiser having some of my money lost, I can certainly kind of see the downside, certainly on the publisher side as well, if I'm a publisher and I'm not getting all of the ad dollars that I expect. But, I think that there's a lot of players in the ad tech ecosystem, and one could argue like, well, the system seems to be working well, 80-90% of the time. So like, why worry about these issues when issues are just going to sprout up again before I know it?
Yeah. So yeah, if you think about it as fraudsters, and this is true of any kind of fraud outside of technology or whatever, they're seeking rent. And rent seeking, whether it's someone demanding a bribe in a country where that's prevalent, or it's insidious, and it creates lots of bad actors who can with impunity really do lots of other nasty, horrible things. So if we just think about this as a money problem, we miss the real impact. I mean, what about all the awful like malvertising that's been installed on people's devices? You know, and that's just a small thing. What about the vectors for doing, and this is outside of our specific conversation today, but like phishing attacks and all that stuff that are enabled by the same people, if not the same vectors that we're talking about, they're all doing this. You know, I mean, it's not like a slippery slope. It's just these are where bad people are making lots of money to fund all the other activities they do. So when you think about it like this, you know, it's not just about, hey, you know, my CPMs are going up by 10%, which is still a big bump. It's, well, what are people doing with that 10%, which is millions and millions of dollars? It's a really, it's a bigger problem than you just put it that way. And if you're only concerned about your bottom line, I mean, what about your reputation as a brand or a reputation as a publisher, knowing that you've been defrauded by these folks, and what are you doing about it? What does it say about you and your business? Do people want to do business with you anymore, whether it's a consumer or a brand looking to activate on your platform?
Yeah, excellent points. So, you know, one thing I think is, I think, you know, seeing the problem that ad fraud represents, I think, you know, however you cut it, it's easy enough to see that the issue. But as you mentioned, you know, one person gets caught and, you know, 5,000 more proliferate. So, like, what actually can be done to fight ad fraud?
That's an excellent question. So what we've seen, and this is what I've actually learned, what I should say, what Human and WhiteOps have seen over the years, the actors are getting more and more sophisticated. So on one end of the spectrum, it's really easy to go and grab some, you know, code. You know, there's lots of, you know, dark web resources for people to grab code and do stuff. Those are relatively easy detected by, you know, technologies like ourselves and anyone who's really hardened their stack. But it's still really easy. What's more interesting is that you've seen some of these more sophisticated attacks go across not just one media at a time, but they're going across multiple different media. So for instance, there was a botnet that we found called Pireno, and it went after the highest CPMs of CPMs, which is a CTV market, which I know we're talking about mobile, but what the vector that they actually did was they created SDKs, and people use those SDKs to create mobile apps that were installed. And in those SDKs, they were doing really interesting things like calling home, and then calling home to find out the headers that were supposed to be now spoofing ads. In theory, these were ad-free, that were spoofing Roku devices. Now, that is a very complicated chain of events to happen in order to basically take advantage of high CPMs in CTV by corrupted mobile devices. It is incredible. But if you imagine how you break that, well, first off, the reason why we saw both sides of that fence. We were monitoring CTV events and we're monitoring mobile events on behalf of our clients, and we got them to talk to each other and we helped investigate, and that's what we did. But more importantly, what can we do as an industry? Well, first off, adapt ads.text, app ads.text, ads.search, like all the initiatives that are out there about cleaning up the industry, supply chain, sellers.json, adopt them all wholesale, because that gives us the ability to actually see valid traffic and valid buyers, valid sellers. And without that, it's very hard. And I would say not just adopt them, make sure they're up to date, leverage things like the Transparency Center at the IAB Tech Lab in order to make sure that, you know, all of these things are well formed and are you know, clean.
Yeah, you know, I think some of that is interesting that, you know, it does show that, you know, some of these industry initiatives work, right? I think when app-ads.txt kind of first rolled out, you know, there was sort of, I can see that there was some hesitation maybe to kind of make all of this data so readily available, right? You know, potentially am I giving away any kind of competitive secrets? But I think as you show, like, that openness is what's needed to fight ad fraud. And, you know, whether or not, you know, you work with X, Y, or Z, it's going to be much more in your interest to you know, get this fraud off of, you know, out of the ecosystem, you know, out of your apps, than it is to show that, you know, you're working with so and so.
100%. And I don't mean to be like jumping around here, but one of the challenges is that we are not very good as an industry at explaining what we do and how we do it to the consumer. And this is one of the initiatives that I think gets a little bit, jumbled around, because this is not about privacy. This is about how we're ensuring that an actual chain of custody for why somebody is involved all the way to the consumer effectively is rightfully, by the way, there's another thing, the ID sources JSON proposal is still being worked on, but that's going to also tie it back to the consumer and making sure that, privacy signals are actually being respected. And that's something we need to be mindful of. That being said, what's really challenging in our industry is as we start considering privacy of the consumer, it means that we also have less fidelity in what's going on from that, and let's call it a human for lack of a better terminology. But yes, is there a human at the end of the chain is going to be critical for us moving forward as not just a binary, but how confident that that's the human that we think we're talking to, who's there. And on the other supply side, are these on the demand side, are those people that we actually want to deal with? I mean, are these bad actors? We can talk about fake news. This entire chain of custody can hide behind privacy signals if we as an industry don't come up with credible means and the important reasons why we need to keep this transparent, independent of who you are. I'm not tracking you. That's not what we're talking about. It's who's trying to reach you and how are they trying to reach you and how many different hops they go through, and is there somebody in the middle trying to take money from somebody here? Like, that's what I need to, like, as an industry, articulate better. And I said too many words there. Apologies.
No, but I think that is a really good point, right? It's less about individual components and more about trust, right? And how do you build trust with the consumer? You do that by guaranteeing their privacy. You do that by ensuring that their devices aren't taken over by bots. You do that by making sure that they're only seeing the right message, in the right kind of places. They're all kind of branches of the same tree, which I think is kind of, sometimes we miss the forest for the trees, when we're kind of talking about each of these individual components.
Yeah, look, I don't miss the pop under. It's all I'm going to say.
But you do bring up a really interesting point, which is this kind of trade-off sometimes that can happen with privacy. So the topic, we're talking about mobile advertising, so I think we have to talk about app tracking transparency and Apple's deprecation of IDFAs, the individual device identifier for advertisers in iOS. Certainly I think there's a lot of value with this move as it relates to privacy. Consumers can opt in to whether information about them and their devices is passed along to advertisers. But that device level data, I could see that maybe that does impact like how we fight ad fraud. So I'm very curious from the human perspective, how do you balance those two as part of the kind of wider push to guarantee trust?
Yeah, as I said, this is one of those challenging topics. Well, first off, we can also talk about regulations and how we're trying to avoid regulations and anti-competitive things. They're all lumped together in a big muddle, which I think the challenge. We at Human believe, and from a regulatory perspective, like, we are not part of that same conversation of, we're not targeting you, we're literally trying to find fraud here. So it's a little bit different in that we have legitimate reasons for being in here from a cybersecurity perspective. Now, that being said, it gets a little bit convoluted when people just hear that you're ad tech or whatever, and now everyone's a bad guy. I think going back to our reputation and trust, we need to do much better, and I'm not being prescriptive of how, of explaining what the value is to that individual. So there's the folks who believe that any form of personalization or whatever is somehow naturally evil and anathema, and that you should blindly be able to everyone should see the same ads no matter who they are. right? Like, I don't necessarily entirely agree with that, because I think that's missing a whole lot of the nuance of, making sure that I'm not seeing, ads are not relevant to me is just as valuable to me as a consumer as somebody trying that. Now, we can talk about it all day. I know there'll be philosophical differences. My concern, though, is with some of these controls, that nuance isn't actually presented to an end consumer of being able to opt into that. They're not seeing the benefits of opting into these things. And there's also not this notion of, if you don't opt into these things, here's what you're missing out on. So, and I'm not going to make this like a doomsday thing. If you don't opt into being tracked, which is a horrible word, let's change track to being targeted. It means that you're missing out on not just the benefits, but also some of the protections that, if we don't know who you are because somebody's misinterpreted what, folks like Human and other players in this industry are also protecting those end devices from things like malware and advertising, et cetera. So it's way too nuanced to put in a checkbox, is all I'm going to say.
Yeah, there's a lot happening behind the scenes. And I think that sort of goes back to a point that you had kind of made earlier. One of the ways in which that is so effectively able to fight fraud, is by kind of having that sort of full viewability and being able to really, have like different players talk to each other, that kind of ecosystem approach. And maybe that's kind of a way forward, and I know Human has done a lot of really fantastic work on that front, just of having that more ecosystem-based approach. Maybe it's the way that we can educate consumers and fight fraud all in one go.
Yeah. So one of the initiatives that we set up is an initiative called the Human Collective. And the reason why is, back to that Pireno example, it's not just a single player who's being defrauded. It is an entire ecosystem play by the bad players out there. So in the case of the Pireno example, we had Roku at the table, and we had a bunch of SSPs and DSPs as well, all dialed in to kind of collectively go after this problem. So as a result of that, we've created this initiative where we get everyone from the agency side. So Omnicom is a member, as well as some of the other big agencies that are having these conversations now all the way to the supply side, and going, no, this is important to us. Yes, we know that on behalf of our clients, it's back to that money. It might be, 1% here, 2% there, but this is important because we need to cut this out. If we cut this out, it means it's a safer place for us to spend our clients' money. And conversely, all the way down at the publisher side, they need to understand that it's not just about, fill rates, et cetera, et cetera. It's like making sure that you're actually getting the advertisers on your platform, that you're attractive. You're not just the long tail of, the worst of the long tail. You're part of a really valuable place where they can feel confident they're reaching their audiences. And the only way to do that is collectively. That means we need to trust not just the consumers trusting us, we need to trust each other. And that's what we're setting out to do. Ironically, through a company that fights fraud. So go figure.
Yeah, but the rising tide that lifts all boats, as it were. That's the hope.
Yes. Yeah, and look, I'm inspired that regulation is one thing, but it's more about maturity. I mean, we all know how the inner tubes kind of came together in such a hodgepodge way, and traditional media is still considered, the upfront isn't dead. We know these things move very slowly. The internet started move fast and break things, and now the legacy business is kind of catching up to the digital side, and the digital side is kind of coming ironically down to buying audiences. So I think we're in an interesting spot where both of these you can programmatically buy linear TV in theory, and now you're going to be programmatically buying audiences, and God forbid we start talking about GRPs again. It's going to be very weird.
Yeah, so I think we're starting to see a little bit of where kind of things are pointing, how things are looking now. So let's let's do a little bit of future prognosticating. We're talking in November 2021, so this is ideal time to do our next year trends. So looking into 2022 and beyond, how do you see the ecosystem and ad fraud evolving? What do you see is coming up on the horizon?
Well, first off, fraud follows money. So where is the most money going? If you just think about it that way, you can look at linear TV shrinking, and you can see how CTV is growing with a CAGR of like 49% by some accounts. I'd also say audio is also in that same boat. I don't know what the vectors are going to look like. It's also very hard to monitor audio. So I would just, if you follow the money, follow the growth, CTV and audio are probably going to be the hot spots. What we have seen, there's as of last year, we started tracking an interesting botnet. We've codenamed it Bellini, and it's actually in the mobile space. It's very sophisticated as far as we can tell. And by the way, I'm not the technical expert here. They're playing arbitrage by buying inventory and then swapping out the actual app IDs to look more attractive, and then making money on an arbitrage. Now, that's on app IDs. You can imagine buying, in theory, swapping out things that are just banners, or God forbid, stacked banners, and those being sold as CTV high end. This is where it's going to be going, and the actors are getting more and more sophisticated. CPUs are cheap. You just need a credit card and an Amazon account to do all this stuff. It's not like you need supercomputers. So it's a scary proposition for somebody who doesn't know how to look at the ins and outs of the entire industry. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, is there suppliers.json? Sure. Have you inspected it? Have you confirmed that it actually matches everything else in that supply chain? It's a trickier, and do it at scale. It's tough.
But the human collective is there to hopefully help and keep some of these advanced threats at bay.
Well, yes, collectively. So I would say the human collective is really just a mechanism to get people to talk. And I think that's the first and foremost. As we're talking, we find the gaps. We tell people, we try to inform people. There's really good stuff out there. I mean, I can't say enough about all the initiatives that the IAB is running, but it's not just that. It's getting people to trust each other to make sure that we're sharing the right level of information that's appropriate from a commercial perspective, but also one that's preserving the I don't want to use the word sanctity, but just the health of the ecosystem. And that's something we should all be passionate about, because if the ecosystem becomes not healthy, that means everybody goes back to their silos, and we end up with the AOLs of yesteryear, where you only see whatever content you're subscribed to. And yes, we already have enough silos in our society. I don't want to contribute to more of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, Sandro, like any conversation I have on ad fraud, I feel both equal parts scared and hopeful. So I think I've definitely appreciate, you coming on and having a chance to chat with us today. Thanks again for sharing your knowledge, and everyone, thanks for tuning in.
Take care, everybody.